This is Ola Bini, a Swedish programmer, a mathematician, a builder of digital bridges. He sits behind a keyboard, writing lines of code that protect the whispers of the world. Code that keeps journalists safe from dictators, code that keeps activists safe from the secret police. In April of 2019, Ola Bini's life did not just change, it evaporated. One minute, he was a free man packing for a martial arts trip to Japan. The next, he was surrounded by tactical police, stripped of his rights, and thrown into a cage. There was no evidence. There was no crime. There was only panic. What happens when a government doesn't understand technology, but fears it? What happens when owning a book on cryptography becomes proof of a conspiracy? He doesn't look like a soldier. He doesn't carry a gun. He doesn't traffic in state secrets or command armies. He is a man of soft features and quiet intellect. He looks like a man you would find in a university library or a coffee shop, lost in the complex abstraction of cryptography. And yet, to the government of Ecuador, this man was a weapon. They called him a mastermind. They called him a destabilizer. They called him a Russian
Swedish
spy.
hacker.
This is not just the story of one man's imprisonment. It is a terrifying glimpse into a world where privacy is treated as a crime and where the people who build our digital locks are treated like burglars. We are going to walk through the nightmare of Ola Bini, from the high-altitude chill of Quito to the roach-infested cells of El Inca prison, and finally to the absurd theater of a courtroom where prosecutors tried to prove that knowing how a computer works makes you a terrorist. Put on your headphones, encrypt your connection, because this story is a warning. To understand why Ola Bini was in handcuffs, you first have to understand who he is, and more importantly, what he believes. Ola is not a hacker in the Hollywood sense. He isn't a guy in a hoodie trying to steal credit card numbers or crash bank servers. He is a developer, but not just any developer. Ola Bini is a core contributor to the world of free and open source software. He worked for ThoughtWorks, a global technology consultancy known for its social conscience. He was a prodigy in the programming language JRuby, but his passion, his obsession was privacy. Ola believes that privacy is a fundamental human right. He believes that in a digital age where every click, every message, and every location ping is tracked by corporations and governments, the only true defense we have is mathematics. Encryption. He didn't just talk about it. He built tools for it. He helped secure the protocols that keep the internet safe. He worked on Tor, the onion router, the browser that allows people to browse the web anonymously. For people living in Sweden or the US, Tor might seem like a tool for the paranoid. But for a journalist in Turkey, for a gay activist in Uganda, for a whistleblower in China, Tor is not a toy. It is oxygen. This was Ola's mission. He wanted to build security for the people, and that mission brought him to Ecuador. Why Ecuador? It wasn't for the weather, it was for the work. In 2013, Ecuador was positioning itself as a haven for digital sovereignty. It was the country granting asylum to Julian Assange. It was a place where the political rhetoric focused on independence from US surveillance. Ola moved to Quito. He fell in love with the country. He set up a center for digital autonomy. He taught local developers how to use encryption. He taught women's rights groups how to communicate without being stalked. He built a life there. He had an apartment filled with books. He practiced jujitsu. He had friends. He was a peaceful man living a quiet life. But the ground beneath his feet was shifting. Politics in South America can change like the weather in the Andes. Suddenly and violently, the government that had welcomed digital activists was gone. A new president, Lenin Moreno, was in power, and Moreno wanted to pivot. He wanted to repair relationships with the United States. He wanted loans from the IMF, And to get those things, he needed to clean house. He needed to get rid of the hacker image. He needed to get rid of Julian Assange. And as it turned out, he needed a scapegoat. April 11th, 2019. This is the day the hammer fell. In London, the doors of the Ecuadorian embassy swung open. British police marched in and dragged a bearded, disheveled Julian Assange out into the sunlight. It was global news. The guest was finally evicted. But thousands of miles away in Quito, the Ecuadorian government was in a panic. President Lenin Moreno was nervous. He had just expelled Assange, but he was terrified of retaliation. He went on national television. He looked into the camera, his face serious, his voice grave. He announced that there was a conspiracy. He claimed that a cell of Russian hackers was active inside Ecuador. He claimed that these hackers were planning to destabilize the government, to hack the databases, to leak private documents in revenge for Assange's arrest. It was a fantastic story. It had everything: spies, Russians, hackers, conspiracy. There was just one problem. They didn't have any Russian hackers. They needed a villain. Fast. They needed someone who looked the part. Someone who was foreign. Someone who knew about computers. Someone who had visited Assange. And there, on their radar, was Ola Bini. Ola had visited Assange in the embassy years prior. He was a friend. He was a privacy advocate. And worst of all, in the eyes of the government, he was a cryptographer. To an uneducated politician, cryptographer sounds a lot like criminal. On the morning of April 11th, Ola Bini was packing his bags. He wasn't fleeing. He had a planned trip to Japan. It was a long-standing plan. He was going to train at the Bujinkan Dojo, a famous martial arts center. He had his GI packed. He had his books. He booked his Uber to the Mariscal Sucre International Airport. He had no idea that his face was already circulating on police WhatsApp groups. He had no idea that the Minister of the Interior, Maria Paula Romo, was already describing him to the press as a key member of WikiLeaks. He was just a guy going to do some judo. The airport in Quito sits on a high plateau. The air is thin. Ola checked in. He went through security. He walked to the gate. He was standing in line to board the plane to Amsterdam, his connection to Tokyo. And then the world stopped. Two police officers approached him. They weren't gentle. They pulled him out of the line. "Come with us," they said. Ola was confused. He spoke fluent Spanish, but the situation didn't make sense. "Why?" he asked. "Just a routine check," they said. But it wasn't routine. They took him to a small room. They started going through his bag. They found his laptop. They found his USB drives. They found his books. And then the tone changed. "Who do you work for? Where are the servers? Are you a Russian spy?" Ola laughed nervously. "I'm Swedish," he said. "Look at my passport. Sweden, not Russia." It didn't matter. The narrative had already been written. The officers weren't listening to him. They were listening to orders coming from the highest levels of the state. They detained him for hours. No lawyer, no phone call. Then they handcuffed him. They drove him back into the city, flanked by sirens. Imagine the fear. You are in a foreign country. You have done nothing wrong. But the men with guns are looking at you like you are a terrorist. The next morning, the press conference happened. Minister Maria Paula Romo stood at a podium. She held up a picture. It wasn't Ola. It was just a silhouette. But she described him perfectly. She said they had captured a key member of the WikiLeaks organization. She said he was carrying hacking equipment. She said he was trying to flee the country to Japan to coordinate attacks. The media went wild. The Swedish hacker, the Russian agent. Ola Bini sat in a holding cell, watching his reputation be shredded on live television. He hadn't been charged with a crime yet, but in the court of public opinion, he was already guilty. If the arrest was a tragedy, the investigation was a farce. Prosecutors raided Ola's apartment. They were looking for the cyber weapons. They were looking for the destabilization center. What did they find? They found books. Lots of books. Books like Cyberpunk by Julian Assange. Books on the Go programming language. Books on network security. To the police, these titles were incriminating. Why would a normal person have a book about cyberpunk unless they were a criminal? They seized the books as evidence. They found USB sticks. Now, if you work in IT, you probably have 10 USB sticks in your drawer right now. Some have Linux distros. Some have backups. Some are empty. To the Ecuadorian prosecutors, these were digital weapons. They photographed them like they were hand grenades. They found his encryption keys. Ola, being a security expert, had his devices locked down tight. He refused to give up his passwords. This is a crucial point. In the world of privacy, your mind is the final sanctuary. You cannot be forced to incriminate yourself. But the prosecutors saw his silence as guilt. If he has nothing to hide, they argued, why won't he unlock the computer? Because Ola would argue privacy is not about hiding crimes. It is about protecting dignity. But dignity doesn't hold much weight when the president wants a conviction. The charges were a mess. First, they accused him of attacking the integrity of computer systems. Which systems? They couldn't say. When? They didn't know. How? They had no idea. They had a man. Now they had to find a crime to fit him. It was a legal fishing expedition. They held him in preventive detention, prison without bail, while they investigated. In Ecuador, preventive detention is supposed to be the exception. For Ola Bini, it became the rule. El Inca Prison. It is a place of concrete, cold, and overcrowding. It is not a place for a Swedish mathematician. Ola was thrown into a cell. No internet, no computer, no books. For a mind that is used to constant stimulation, to solving complex logical problems, this was torture. The conditions were horrific. No running water for days. Food that was barely edible. He slept on a thin mattress or sometimes the floor. But the worst part was the threat. The other prisoners knew who he was. They had seen the news. The hacker, the millionaire spy. They assumed he had money. They assumed he had connections. Extortion attempts began. Threats were whispered in the yard. Pay us or you don't sleep. Ola Bini spent 70 days in that prison. 70 days of gray walls. He tried to keep his mind sharp. He did mental math. He wrote code in his head. He meditated. He practiced the breathing techniques from his martial arts training. He wrote letters. I am cold, he wrote, but I am not broken. Outside the walls, a movement was growing. The global tech community was waking up. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, Amnesty International, the United Nations, they all looked at the case and said, this is insane. Free Ola Bini became a rallying cry. But inside the walls, Ola was alone. He later described the feeling of total powerlessness. The realization that your life, your entire existence, is in the hands of a bureaucrat who doesn't know the difference between Java and JavaScript. The realization that you might never leave. June 2019. After months of legal wrangling, a breakthrough. Ola's defense team, led by fierce human rights lawyers, filed for habeas corpus. They argued that his detention was illegal, that there was no evidence, that holding him without charge was a violation of his human rights. The provincial court agreed. In a stunning reversal, the judges ruled that the arrest had been arbitrary. They ruled that the prosecutors had violated due process. They ordered his immediate release. Ola walked out of El Inca. He was thinner. He was pale. His beard had grown out, but he was smiling. He thought it was over. He thought, okay, they made a mistake. Now I can go home. He was wrong. Leaving prison was not the end of the nightmare. It was just the beginning of the labyrinth. The state was embarrassed. They had made a huge public show of capturing the Russian spy. They couldn't just let him walk away. It would be a humiliation for the president. So they doubled down. They couldn't keep him in prison, but they could keep him in the country. They barred him from leaving Ecuador. They froze his bank accounts. They required him to report to the prosecutor's office every single week to sign a piece of paper. Every Friday, for years. And the investigation continued. They spent years looking for something, anything, on his computers. They brought in experts. One expert report stated that the presence of the Tor browser on his computer was suspicious. Another report claimed that having encryption keys indicated criminal intent. It was a war of attrition. They wanted to break him. They wanted him to plead guilty to something small just to make it go away. But Ola refused. He knew that if he pled guilty, he would be setting a precedent. He would be admitting that privacy is a crime. So he stayed, he waited, and he fought. Finally, after years of fishing, the prosecution found their smoking gun, or so they thought. They found a screenshot, an image Ola had sent to a colleague years ago. It showed a terminal window, a black screen with green text. It showed the command telnet. The command was connecting to a public server belonging to CNT, the state telecommunications company. The prosecutors pointed at this and screamed, "AHA, hacking." They claimed that Ola had attempted to gain unauthorized access to the state's infrastructure. Now, let's pause for a second. If you are listening to this cast, you probably know what telnet is. It is a basic network protocol. It's like knocking on a door to see if anyone is home. Using telnet to check if a server is online is not hacking. It's not an attack. It's barely even an interaction. It is the digital equivalent of looking at a building from the sidewalk. Ola's defense team brought in expert witnesses. They explained, patiently, "Your Honor, this is an open port. This is a public server. There was no password breach. There was no data theft. There was no intrusion. He literally just pinged the server." It was like accusing someone of bank robbery because they walked past the bank and looked at the ATM. But the prosecution spun a tale of dark magic. They used words like cyber intelligence and illicit access. They relied on the judge's ignorance. Technology is scary to those who don't understand it, and fear is a powerful weapon in a courtroom. The trial dragged on, day after day, hearing after hearing. More than 100 hearings were suspended or delayed. It was psychological torture. Ola would put on his suit, go to court, wait for 3 hours, and then be told, "The prosecutor is sick. Come back next week." He was living in a state of suspended animation, unable to work, unable to leave, unable to plan a future. January 2023, 4 years after the arrest, the trial finally reached its conclusion. The courtroom was tense. Observers from human rights organizations lined the benches. Ola stood before the tribunal. He looked tired. The years of stress had etched lines into his face. The judges deliberated. And then the verdict, unanimous, innocent. The judges ruled that the prosecution had failed to prove a crime. They said the evidence was insufficient. They said that using a telnet command does not constitute unauthorized access. They vindicated Ola Bini. Tears, hugs, relief. The headline flashed around the world. Ola Bini acquitted. He walked out of the court a free man. He could finally go back to Sweden. He could finally see his family. But wait, this is not a movie. This is the Ecuadorian legal system. The prosecutors appealed. Of course they did. And in Ecuador, when an appeal is filed, the restrictions often remain. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase. Months later, an appeals court, in a move that shocked legal experts, overturned the innocent verdict. Without new evidence, without a new trial, they simply looked at the same facts and decided, no, actually, he is guilty. They sentenced him to 1 year in prison. It was a crushing blow. How can one court say, there is zero evidence, and the next say, guilty? It wasn't about law. It was about face-saving. It was about politics. As of today, Ola Bini remains in a legal limbo. He is still fighting. His lawyers are taking the case to the National Court of Justice. They are preparing to go to international human rights courts. But the damage is done. 5 years of a life stolen, a reputation scarred, and a message sent to every digital activist in the region.
The truth will emerge, no matter the cost.
Why does the story of Ola Bini matter? Why should you, listening to this in your car or your office, care about a Swedish coder trapped in the Andes? Because this case was never really about Ola Bini. It was about sending a signal. The signal is this: privacy is suspicious. If you use encryption, you are hiding something. If you understand how a network works, you are a threat. If you build tools that empower the people, you are an enemy of the state. We live in a world where our digital lives are increasingly transparent to those in power. We rely on people like Ola Bini to build the curtains, the locks, and the shutters. We rely on them to create the spaces where we can whisper without being heard. When the government arrests the locksmith, who is safe? When owning a book about cryptography is treated like owning a bomb, making manual innovation dies. Developers become afraid to experiment. Researchers become afraid to publish. The chilling effect is real, and it is freezing cold. Ola Bini is still in Ecuador. He wakes up every day looking at the mountains that have become his prison walls. He still writes code. He still advocates for privacy. But he does it with the weight of a state looking over his shoulder. He is a reminder that the battle for the internet is not just fought with code. It is fought in courtrooms. It is fought in prisons. And it is fought by ordinary people who simply refuse to give up their right to be private. This is Ola Bini. He is a programmer. He is a friend. And he is proof that, in a surveillance state, being free is the most dangerous crime of all. This story forces us to confront a terrifying reality. The war on privacy is no longer being fought in the shadows. It is being waged in broad daylight, in courtrooms where technical literacy is treated as a weapon. They are betting that if they make an example of the architects, the rest of us will be too afraid to build the walls we need to survive. They want us to believe that safety requires total exposure. So do not look away. Do not let the complexity of the law or the distance of the geography fool you into apathy. Ola's silence is our silence. His cage is our cage. Support the toolmakers. Defend the coders who defend you. Because if the code breakers win, there will be nowhere left to hide. Stay safe. Stay encrypted. And remember, Ola is just one name on a growing list. For every headline we see, there are a dozen anonymous developers in basements from Cairo to Caracas who are pausing their hands over the keyboard, wondering if they are next. That hesitation is the death of liberty. That pause is where the authoritarian wins. They are counting on us to get tired, to get bored, and to accept the surveillance as the new normal. We must be the ones to break that silence. We must be the ones to say that writing code is not a crime, and protecting secrets is not an act of war. It is an act of survival. So keep your keys close, keep your networks open, and never stop watching the watchers. The future isn't written in ink anymore. It's written in code. Make sure it's code that keeps us free.